of Stevens Institute of Technology, and Bridget D'Souza, formerly of Deloitte Tax LLP and founding member of Jersey City Schools Meetup. I hope you'll all stick around because these folks have been waiting for their moment in the sun, and what they'll have to say is going to be very interesting. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know that obviously we're the last panel here, but we're very pleased to present a discussion here at least about tax abatements. Bridget's been very influential in terms of what she's done online, and I'm grateful to be here on the panel this afternoon. I figured
into this policy, there were a couple issues that I found just in researching it a little bit. One was the trust fund, and what I'm about to say I learned at a city council meeting through some Q&A with the city council during the second ordinance reading. The trust fund that is supposed to hold those construction costs doesn't exist yet. It didn't exist at the time that the 369th Street abatement was approved. And from an accounting perspective, it's very important that a trust fund actually exists, because if those funds aren't held in trust, then those funds can be used for something other than the original intent. Now, there is this notion of, well, we can trust our city officials, and if we have verbal assurances from the city council that we're going to spend they're going to spend this money, we can maybe say, okay, well, no, I believe they're going to spend that money later in a way that they really intended to. I don't have faith in my government to do that. Just by nature, I think we're a society of written rules and written laws, and if you say that something's in trust, it should be in trust, and it should be in writing. So the fact that this trust fund didn't exist, in my opinion, is a problem. Okay? I would like to see that trust fund. I'd like to understand exactly where the funds are going, and I'd like some written assurances as to exactly how the funds are going to be used. The other issue that exists with the policy is that and I researched this, and I asked a lot of different people, and I actually tried to make queries of the mayor's office, but I didn't get I never heard back, basically. I submitted a list of questions, and then there were a lot of attempts to kind of meet with the mayor personally, and it just never happened. The meeting never happened. The mayor's office never consulted the Board of Education on whether or not building pre-K facilities was a good idea in Jersey City. So when I went and I asked people in the Board of Ed about this, they said, well, that's not really the best use of abatement funds, and there's a lot of complexity of the school side of this. And I realize that that I can't be too much longer, but with respect to the policy, I'll just go through four sort of bullets on the issue with this pre-K concept. Number one, the Jersey City Board of Education has no budget to build schools. Okay, we are not allowed to build our own schools. Part of that is it's really because we're an Abatement district, but also that's just the way it works in New Jersey. In New Jersey, there's a state-level agency called the Schools Development Authority, and they are responsible for coming in and building schools and basically doing any major kind of construction, renovation, or updates. That agency is sort of what I would term dysfunctional. It hasn't really performed its job. The funds have been frozen by Christie. That's a whole other topic. But basically, Jersey City doesn't have a budget. They don't have a capital budget. So the notion of the Jersey City Board of Education getting involved in the building of pre-K facilities is sort of a flawed premise. Because number one, they're not in the business of building facilities, but number two, they don't have the budget for this. Okay, they can't contribute to this concept financially. Number two, there's nothing in the policy that caps the rent. So even if the Board of Ed were to entertain this idea or like a project where they funded the building of a pre-K facility, there's nothing that prohibits a developer from turning around and then charging market rate rents on that facility to the Board of Ed. Now, the Board of Ed is probably an ideal tenant for a developer, because if the Board of Ed is not watching its budget, right? Because the Board of Ed, from a developer's point of view, if you can get the Board of Ed into a building and then charge them market rate rents, you've got sort of a guaranteed tenant over 20, 30 years. So there's some problems there, because that means that if, in the Board of Ed, you need to make sure you have people who are really watching that budget, making sure that they're not spending prohibitively high rent. Now, this issue has actually played itself out in the local press with respect to a facility on the west side called the Penrose Project, and there's an affordable housing project over on the west side. It's on Duncan Avenue, just north of Lincoln Park, and the mayor wanted the Board of Education, offered sort of in partnership with the Housing Authority, and the Board of Ed to build a pre-K facility at that affordable housing site. There was never any sort of clear contractual terms other than a PowerPoint presentation that was presented by the developer to define what the terms were of building this pre-K facility. And the pre-K facility, one figure that the developer put forward was that it would be $5 million to finance it. So again, there's this, the transparency again is an issue. Okay, there still hasn't been sort of a contract in place. And by the way, the developer pulled out of that deal about 2 hours before the Board of Ed was set to have a public hearing on the topic. So no budget to build schools, no caps on rent, decreased transparency. Again, transparency comes back into this equation. And the reason for that is that if the Board of Ed were to build its own facility, it would be required to go through a very strict procurement process that would be subject to a lot of rules around increasing, around transparency and making sure the public understood. With the abatement policy, what we have is sort of an end run around those Board of Ed sort of disclosure rules. So basically, if the Board of Ed is going to build school buildings, it should do it through its own means, not sort of in partnership with the mayor's office, because of this transparency issue. And finally, the other issue I think that exists with the policy is that there's no real focus beyond pre-K. I mean, why do we have a policy that only builds pre-K facilities? What happens when those kids age out of pre-K and go to kindergarten, up through 8th grade, and then through high school? And these are just, so those are the four things. Buildings, no budget to build schools, no cap on rent, decreased transparency, and no focus beyond pre-K. Those are why the build a pre-K facility concept of buying up an abatement is in my opinion, flawed. I know I covered a lot. And
Does anybody have any questions on this abatement issue?
Look into the legality of the council voting on monies going from an abatement into the trust fund, and then the same council later on voting on where that money is going, whether it's recreation or somewhere else. It kind of borders a payoff of sorts. Anyone look into that legality?
Because this is a great question, and there might be resources out there that can kind of address that. I don't know. I think it's a good question. I think Mia, you might have actually.
Yeah, no, I contacted the state, but unfortunately they have no people left in the Division of Law. This is very much like Schundler's recreation fund. So he's trying to hide it through a trust fund. And what happened with that money, it got squandered on ski trips to South America, whitewater rafting. It's absurd. And we lost millions of dollars worth of tax monies until the state put the kibosh on it. But unfortunately, we can't seem to reach anybody at the state right now.
Most people know that I wrote a book about Newark and its community development efforts. And obviously Cory Booker got in the thick of this last year dealing with the Devil's Arena deal. You'll remember that episode. It was really kind of a Telemundo soap opera. And I was going back and forth between Vanderbeek and City Hall. And some of the agreements that they made early on to get the project underway included an agreement to help out with some community recreational money coming directly from the owners of the Devils. And the thought was that, we'll do this as a set-aside fund. Similar to this, to some degree, saying, there were promises made with some of this money in an effort to get, certain reduced costs for taxes and for a lot of the development with the arena project, that they were going to get some kind of money going back towards doing like ice hockey programming and doing all kinds of recreational services. In fact, it didn't come to fruition until years later when they recognized, there has to be a follow-through, this takes place. And that was the kind of the disagreement. So I don't want, you see this in a lot of cities. There was all this talk also in Hoboken that they were going to do this as well in terms of making some agreements with developers, so they were going to have recreation and park services. Developers love to kind of enter into these kind of agreements. The problem is, does it really have teeth? Are the developers in fact going to come through? What are the legal attachments to it? The problem is that in a lot of these cities, and I know I hate picking on New Jersey because New Jersey seems to do a lot of this, but okay. The problem is that it does not have the backing of the legal authority, and so unless it really has that, it's pretty loose. It's pretty loose.
But then, what are the impact on these corporations once the abatements are over? They just go over to paying property taxes, and how do they affect respective renters, tenants?
a good question. I mean, I assume what basically happens is they transition into conventional taxpayers. It's a really good question because I think it would be an interesting analysis to see the impact, to, for instance, one of those Newport buildings, what happens to their profit margin when they convert to conventional taxes. Does their profit margin decrease? And if so, does that then mean that they increase the rents?
I can also add to that. We met with Bob Kakaleski last week, and I asked him exactly that question. What's going to happen when these projects convert, and what's the impact on revenues going to be? And his answer was, it's a really good question. Unfortunately, we don't have the financial manpower to analyze a lot of this. He said he is, I'm just giving you the party line right now. This is something that he claims to be very interested in, and he is trying to staff up right now with more financial firepower, more CPAs and analysts to figure this stuff out. But they don't have the answer to that right now.
Part of the problem with abatements is that every abatement contract is different. So it's different. That increases the lack of transparency. I don't know if we can even answer how, everyone is different.
Standard.
There's no standard. An abatement is a contract, and the developer enters into that contract with the city, and it's terms. It's like any contract you'd enter into, as a personal person.
Which is why I was trying to reinforce, at least in my research, was that there's got to be at least a set of criteria, at least some kind of consistency if that's possible. And of course, again, the reports indicate that as well. And I don't want to just pick on Jersey City. A lot of cities have the same problem with the tax abatements.
Can I just
Sorry. Yes.
Is anyone currently monitoring when these expire to make sure we're collecting the right taxes? I know it wasn't happening. Is it happening now?
So,
do we know?
Another great question. As Mia alluded to earlier, the state has sort of been gutted in terms of, so there's really very little monitoring. And the New Jersey comptroller...
but the city has no one monitoring that?
Not
They
really.
did. They did.
This,
He retired, they found out that he didn't do his job, and we lost millions of dollars.
Who did it?
See, yeah, absolutely.
I would
So
say
they went
probably
back
true.
7 years.
I would say there was an audit that was begun toward, I guess it was in early 2009, the former business manager, Kelly. I mean, some of the results of that came in early into the new administration. I think that has just indicated that it should be more robust. There was an employee of the city who, I won't comment on their performance, but who was doing it as part of their job.
That
right?
was their job. He had a two-person staff.
So, but I think there's somebody. There's been some outside
It went under the
contracts given.
No, it was under the tax collector's realm, and they were able to collect $25 million. So that's why Fulop's got a lot of money right now.
if I could just comment on this, because I actually have recently looked into this question, and I'm actually hopefully publishing an article I'm hoping for Monday, that deals with this. So what I recently learned is that the city, let me just explain that when the city computes the cost of an abatement, okay, and just let's step back and just think about abatements in general, a building, all right? What is it? An abatement's cost is driven by the number of people who will live in the building and by the number of public school students who will go to school in that building, okay? So residents and public school students. Those numbers, they're basically demographic estimates, okay? If you think about Jersey City in the early 1990s, there were fewer people coming here, okay? You have probably more single people coming and working in the city versus now. Now you have probably more families. Our population, according to census data as a city, has grown by 11% from the early 1990s until 2012, I believe it is. So we've been growing. And we've been becoming more of a destination city for families who want to stay. And also, in the late 90s, free pre-K came to Jersey City. So there's an economic incentive to stay in Jersey City, if you're a parent, at least through pre-K4, because if you move outside the city, you have to pay for pre-K. You have to pay for private preschool. So students and residents, that number drives the cost of an abatement. What I recently learned is that the city has been using estimates from the early 1990s to cost abatements in 2014. So that basically means that developers have been getting discounts on their abatements. They've been paying 1990s rates for abatements in 2014. So that means that it's kind of complicated, but basically it's not complicated in the sense that conceptually, but I'll just walk through it quickly. their profit margin is very high right now, okay? Because they're able to charge 2014 rates. A developer in 2014 up in Newport, for instance, Lefrak is charging much higher rates for a one-bedroom panel than he was in early 1990s. So this is a problem because this reveals a lot about the city's lack of oversight. And I will say right now, it's no one person, it's no one politician, it's no one, you know, this is why the community really needs to become educated on this issue, because the fact that the city's been using early 1990s demographics shows a lack of oversight, quite frankly.
And this also partly explains why the state was so involved and so invested in on something like this, was that, you know, who exactly is monitoring, who's controlling, and what number of data are they using? The problem is there's no real consistency. And again, I don't want to, like you said, you don't want to point fingers, because each administration, they all deal with it differently, and again, I don't really see any continuity in terms of what formulas they're using. That's kind of the interesting quirk in all this. Even if you go back to the Schindler days, there were problems then too. So it would be nice to see some uniformity through each administration, and let's face it, we do go through a lot of mayors in the city, so and certainly administrations and directors and God knows council members. So you know, to be consistent, it would be nice to see at least some kind of continuity in terms of formulas, data, and criteria. If that's even plausible.
Yeah. Since you guys have brought up the impact on education, I wondered if you could explain the relationship between abatements and adjustment aid from the state.
You know, I hesitate to speak to that because I don't fully, it's like a whole other ball of wax. My understanding is that adjustment...
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So the relation, are you familiar with adjustment
A little
aid?
bit, yeah.
Okay, why don't you address this, because...
So that's just more or less, you're speaking about towards state aid is coming in.
Well, state aid comes in multiple categories,
Right.
so I'm speaking specifically of the $114 million in adjustment aid from the state.
Right, and again, that depends on the municipality. It oftentimes
Well,
depends,
in Jersey.
right, even just in Jersey City, but sometimes you don't see the same amount of money coming through every year for the budget. So the problem is that depends on, it's oftentimes political. I mean, you saw this certainly with the Chris administration, where some, I don't want to just use Jersey City, but even in Newark, you see other cities where it's not going to be consistent amount of aid every
Right.
year.
Well, Newark, for instance, doesn't get that amount of adjustment aid because the adjustment aid is calculated based on the loss of property
Right.
taxes from abatements.
Right.
Could you hold that thought for a second?
Issue of the relationship between the schools, because I think that's also another way, in fact, that presently the city is getting its money twice. When you get your pilot to the city, to whatever, or wherever it goes, maybe they're even getting it 3 times if you're getting your trust fund, it's not a trust fund. But then you get your adjustment aid, which is from the state to the school district. Initially, if there was no adjustment aid from the state, there would be a net loss in revenue to the school system. But there isn't, because the state pays in what Jersey City should be paying but doesn't pay. The state pays. So I just was interested in how you guys had thought about if there are dangers of that, if it means that the city is balancing its budget based on the state.
Okay, so I want to preface what I'm about to say with this, that we really need an informed town hall from the Board of Education on how their financing works, okay? That's really, again, it goes to the puzzle pieces kind of fitting together. The Board of Education is a huge stakeholder, and one of the things in the comptroller's report that he pointed out is that school districts are a major stakeholder that are not invited to the table in negotiating abatements. So I'm going to speak to your question just kind of from my perspective in what I do know about this. So I first became involved, like sort of the catalyst for me starting to really write about abatements was learning about the Journal Square abatement. That was the first notable abatement approved under the Fulop administration. And I learned that there was no, that the abatement funding would not be directly allocated into the school system. So when Mayor Fulop was running for office to become mayor, that was one of his campaign promises, was abatements need to help fund the school system, and I'm going to take abatement funding and I'm going to create a, and there was language in his platform that was like a allocated specific account from the abatement into the school system. And when I learned that with the Journal Square abatement that didn't happen, that's really when I started paying attention to abatements, because I thought, well, if he's not keeping that campaign promise, what does that mean for support of the schools? So, and I actually had a conversation with a couple city officials, and that exact point was brought up. If you take abatement funding and you you put some of that into local city coffers, the state aid might go down. And it's good for in my opinion, it strikes me, and again, totally personal opinion, the morally right thing to do is to help fund your own school system and not sort of hide your wealth from the state, because that's kind of what an abatement is. You're hiding your taxable wealth from the state. So my parents, who are retirees in Florham Park, on a fixed income, are going to be subsidizing the education of sort of abated buildings in downtown Jersey City. Morally, I'm not okay with that. I don't think that's right. I think if you live in a piloted building, which I lived in Newport when we owned a condo there, you should be helping to pay for the school system. I just think it's a public good. We have a public interest in educating all of our school children, and why are we kind of monkeying around with the fiscal sort of, realities of that? That's my own personal sort of, as a parent.
I have to wrap it up.
I think there was a question. There was another question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bill, can
Do you want to?
possibly
please.
last question? One last question?
No, that's all right. I'll just say, well, first the disclosure again that I worked for the city for nearly 9 years, and I've actually talked on abatements at continuing legal education things. First, great job. I thought it was really good. It's so impressive that people who are like not working for developers or government have this much knowledge. Very helpful. I just wanted to say a few things. Now that I'm not afraid of being audited by Matt Boxer, I will say that I found his report to be poor. And most notably, I found that the biggest deficiency being he didn't take the time to talk to one city official or to one developer. So I found it odd that he would feel qualified to opine on abatements without doing that. I think the big question when it comes to abatements is it's really this: is the but-for analysis really there, right? Like, but for the pilot, will this development occur or not? And talking to Mark Pfeiffer outside, it's like the developers come to the table with more ability, more knowledge than you guys do, the city people, and it's true, right? They're only ones who will know. But in my opinion, if the but-for analysis, you're going to err on the side of I think the city who wants to see development, you're going to say, well, if this is going to make this building occur where there's a vacant lot and it's going to bring people to go on Kennedy Boulevard or Newark Avenue, whatever, and more money than we would otherwise get, because all that pilot revenue is money that you would get nothing or something very minimal. Last thing I'll say is on the education side, we have to look at pilots. Okay, this is a state statute. The policy's been set by the legislature. Okay, that's where the policy is. We're supposed to be implementing it. We can modify it. You're supposed to be implementing the policy. And the state legislature, which also said that we should fund Abbott district schools, because we've had an enormous decline in our cities. We've had a lot of poor people in our cities, still in Jersey City. And I hope and think that it's appropriate for the wealthier areas of the state. I think it's in their best interest to continue to fund our cities. But I think that that's the biggest issue of the day is, what's the appropriate portion of that money that we should be putting toward the schools, especially now that there's been a threat out there looming and that the state's going to stop funding us, at least to the robust levels that they have to
Jersey City, and other cities.
Not just Jersey City, all the
cities.
Can I just make one quick sort of point on top of that? I think two things. I'd love to see an analysis from the city that justifies that but-for analysis, because we don't have that right now. So that's the one thing I say in response to that. I agree with you. And the New Jersey policy perspective, they did a comparison of the Sugar House pilot between conventional taxes and the pilot payments. And one thing they omitted, to your point, is it could have been zero, because a developer could have not renovated the Sugar House, which, by the way, is in Paulo. It's a beautiful building.
For
So
millions of dollars.
I think it's a legitimate point, but I think the city owes taxpayers a justifiable analysis of the pilot itself, because in my research and also kind of the sense I get, so I don't have any data to really to justify this, but this is my sense, is that tax abatements are being used as sort of market tools, not really as tax policy tools. We've kind of gotten into that realm. The other thing I just wanted to say was that the state aid is going down. So a couple years ago it was at 75%. I think the upcoming year it's at 65%. So the state aid, we are seeing it actually go down.
And let me add to this too. I think the important thing is that when it comes to land remediation, certainly cleaning up a lot of the land that has been problematic in terms of industry and manufacturing that once existed. it's been tremendous, at least for a lot of developers, to take this on as an initiative, and hence part of the reason for the tax abatement. It does help out in that effort. What Bill brought up here, I think, is a good point, is the fact that when we're dealing with a lot of these laws, it is on the state books, obviously, in NJSA and New Jersey State, annotated statutes here. They're referring to at least NJSA 40A21-1, which is the 5-year exemption abatement. If you're also interested in long-term one, is NJSA 40A20-1 as well. If you look at that within the state statutes here, it's quite amazing to see kind of the language. And it would be good to at least reinvestigate this at the state level and the impact of it at the local level. But there's got to be some communication between all these levels of government. And I don't want to exclude the county government in all this, because obviously they're very critical in working with the cities and dealing with education financing, let alone property taxes. So I don't want to exclude the county too. But there's got to be some kind of consistency even with the levels of government. And unfortunately, Billy, you brought that up. Part of it is just a lack of communication, or just a direct connection. And we're still only seeing that, as you all raised here, with even the school board. I mean, are they aware of some of this too? It's important that there's some kind of dialogue and communication taking place between our government officials and even the developers as well, and what we're getting into. But as taxpayers, we should be concerned as well. And I'm kind of surprised that we're not seeing more of a response to this, especially with our property taxes increasing. I mean, quite frankly, I'm getting a little bit binged at it living in Paul's Hook, right next to, actually right there to the Sugar House. So you have to wonder, just as a taxpayer, okay, what's the impact on this for everybody else in our own neighborhoods?
Can't thank you guys enough for coming out. You stuck around to the bitter end. It was longer than we had planned, but I think there was an amazing amount of really detailed, thoughtful discussion. The presenters were just wonderful. I hope that we can do this again. We saw a tax forum, a budget forum that was really special. I hope you get the word out that there's a core group of people, amongst yourselves included, that are getting up to speed on these really thorny issues. So thanks so much for coming out.